SEP Fanfic Readings presents Measure of a Man by Inna Days 22. Chapter 24. The Passage of Time. July 26th, 2011. Clocks. Not only decorative, serving as a reminder that time would always pass. Forever in infinite motion, they were full of chaotic fluctuations. Marked by each tick of the clock, seconds turned into minutes, which compounded into hours, constantly moving forward as they watched the storm, first by the window, then on the sofa. The silence was as unsteady as the erratic beat of raindrops pelting the windows. When Hermione next looked at the clock, it was 10 minutes after 5, a time delicately balanced between the end of night and the beginning of a new day. It was also when Draco's hand released hers for the first time. Draco. Words of intent, a hand in hers. The startling amalgamation of moments and actions unearthed a full-formed name from the seeds of nothing. For all Hermione's denial, the digging and pulling at the pesky roots, her mental shift was seamless. In the same way the end of one chapter always sparked the beginning of the next. Natural progression. The inside of the Malfoys' home was dark and silent as the storm marched on, unabated and undiminished. Rain, wind, thunder, lightning. Peaceful but unsettling, atmospheric but stark. Exactly how Hermione felt with her back against the guest room door. Too late to sleep, yet too early to begin the day. The only thing exchanged when they parted ways was a suggestion that they each shower, change, and meet in his office. To talk. Hermione arrived half an hour later with wet hair and 2 vials to get them through what was sure to be a long day. Draco was already there with tea and no arguments about the potion, both of which she hadn't expected. They drank each vial before sitting on opposite ends of the sofa. Hermione felt better, more clear-headed and less tired almost instantly. Her body was tricked into believing she'd had a full night's sleep. After shifting into a new position, facing him with the knee bent, she accepted the floating teacup with both hands. Black tea, splash of milk. Simple but good. While enjoying the hot drink, Hermione observed the slight differences in his all-black attire along with his wet hair. The rain battering the windows, and the occasional crack of lightning illuminating the portions of his lowly lit office were the only sounds in the space. The air between them was cozy, but tense. It defied description, yet needed no explanation. Uniquely comfortable. Ever present. Reclined on the cushions, Draco projected relaxation with his legs crossed and his arm resting on the armrest. Hermione silently wondered if he was restless, looking for cues to help answer the lingering question, but found none. Still, he drank slowly, as if the world, and by extension her, went unnoticed. Hermione had long since finished by the time he leaned forward to place his empty teacup on the table. He broke the silence with a deep, resonant chuckle. "You look as though you're dying to speak." Draco returned to his seemingly casual position before turning, a curious quirk on his lips as he gave Hermione his undivided attention. "I'm not, actually." Hermione picked at the cuticles of her nails, but she could still feel his eyes on her. She quickly dropped her hands and lifted her head, ready to speak honestly. "I wouldn't know what to say, nor do I have any idea how to begin navigating this." "You could start by moving." He rested a hand on the sofa next to him, eyes firmly on her as he patted the cushion once, twice. It was a bold gesture, an indication that temporarily confused her, until its meaning left Hermione both jarred and flushed in an aggravatingly adolescent way. Move closer. Once again, her nature pulled her in different directions, as if on a pendulum swinging between sensible and absurd. The former kept Hermione stationary, but the latter brought her out of her folded position. With a stubborn frown on her face, she slowly scooted until she was at the spot where his hand had just been. Any closer and Hermione would be sitting on him. Draco stretched an arm along the back of the sofa behind her head, while the other maintained its spot on the armrest. For comfort? Hermione's new seat didn't afford her the space to dissect the reasons behind the sequence of actions. His proximity introduced an opportunity for observation that wasn't limited to sight alone. Better? Not at all. Draco was freshly shaven, his wet blonde hair combed into place, but Hermione was drawn to subtle details. That was becoming a habit around him. Draco smelled clean, a subtle, woodsy scent that was almost heady from her place at his side. But that was nothing. Normal enough. What had got her was something else. Heat. It radiated from him like a vibration. Hermione chalked it up to some sort of controlled energy that affected her as well. She ran tense hands down the front of her jeans, gripping her knees and curling her fingers into fists. It was a strange feeling. Their closeness, the storm, the solitude of his office. She felt silly for considering a sip of calming draught to unwind the knot in her stomach. The circumstances, time of day, and energy were different, but sitting under Draco's rigid scrutiny wasn't as new as his intent behind every action. Or was it? Hermione had realized her own attraction. She'd starved the stubborn thing and resisted giving it a name, but the feeling grew anyway. Terrible, really. Draco's attraction to her was unfathomable, defied logic. Surprising, considering their push and pull from the very start, not to mention their history. The fact that she was now standing at the precipice of this impossible point proved the cosmos definitely had a sense of humor. How? When? Why? What had she missed? Clearly a substantial amount, given the last few hours. The massive blow to her ego that stemmed from the lack of awareness of Draco's intent beforehand left Hermione irritated and scrambling for knowledge and answers, searching through tomes of comments and moments and looks she'd consistently tucked away in order to build a proper timeline. Analyzing this would take all day. No, week. What are we scheduled to work on this evening? Draco's voice was low, edged in a fashion that churned the growing anxiety in her stomach. I haven't looked. Why? We should add time to our schedule starting tonight, if you have it available. At both her sharp look and raised brow, Draco clarified. To have conversations that don't pertain to work. Oh, like getting to know each other better? Yes. Okay. An awkward chuckle escaped Hermione before she could stop it. But if your next suggestion is the addition of wine, I might think you're suggesting a date. Not exactly. He drew his arm off the back of the sofa, resting his hand on his thigh and tapping his finger. A small quirk of his she associated with repressed unease. I would call it a prelude of sorts. What is the prelude of dating? Confusion wrinkled her brow as she pressed her lips together in a thoughtful frown. I'm hardly a delicate flower, so courtship sounds Victorian and outdated. Draco went very still, as did she. Oh, okay, you're serious. I am. Hermione tried to push past her initial judgment and into the foundation of this idea. From what she knew, courting involved getting to know a potential partner and deciding if they were worth pursuing. For her and Draco, it would be an opportunity to determine if their attraction and compatibility ran deeper than surface level, if it was sustainable. If it's not real or genuine, I don't want it. The familiar words echoed in her head. When Hermione gave it a thought, though, well, it wasn't entirely unreasonable. I'm not sure exactly what your suggestion entails. She sat up straighter, slowly processing the idea. Is there an official? Nothing official. We will set our own rules and boundaries. Draco placed a careful hand over hers. The move was less bold and more understated. Perhaps that was why Hermione flipped her hand under his, flattened her palm, and laced their fingers together. Thunder rolled, and their joined hands remained a warm weight on her thigh. The urge to distance herself from the moment surged, then dulled, her muddied thoughts clearing. I should review my contract with your mother to make certain I'm not... You can if you'd like, but I've already done the thorough review. When Hermione recoiled in shock, Draco glanced down at their hands. There was no clause in it that we're violating at this time. When did you review it? Draco didn't answer, looking instead at his bookshelves. Foresight was indicative of purpose, and Hermione grew annoyed by the mounting clues that she was trailing behind. Slow on the uptake, she couldn't place the moment when childhood animosity and adult indifference had begun to shift in this unexpected direction for him. But Hermione didn't press, exacting a patience she didn't know existed. at least as it pertained to pursuit of knowledge. Her mind was running rampant with what any potential answers could possibly mean for the whens and hows that kept creeping around in search of clarity. Part of her had to know, was desperate to ask, but Hermione strategically suppressed that urge. He didn't appear willing to discuss it, and she knew her questions would only lead to answers she wasn't ready to hear. There are still questionable ethics involved in our... Naturally. Draco's interruption was smooth, as if she'd expected the argument. In the future, should we pursue anything further, I imagine there will need to be a different discussion. As of now, however, I trust this won't interfere with my mother's care. Of course it won't. Nothing would change. Hermione touched her still wet bun. And you and I will continue to work together on our current project separate from our courtship. She really needed to think of a better term. Draco's fingers twitched in hers before he tightened his grip. The rest we will sort through, but not right now. Fair, but as soon as Hermione tried to relax, as she had earlier in the conservatory, she winced at the new thought quickly sprouting above all the others. What about your mother? What about her? His inflection reflected his ambivalence. Should we tell her? It was a conversation she'd rather not have, but it was as inevitable as the spread of a wildfire. She could only imagine the one Narcissa would start if she knew. Whether you like it or not, your mother has expectations of you that she hopes you will fulfill. She may respect me on some level, but I don't think she likes me. And I certainly don't think she considers me a worthy potential... It's not my mother's decision. Draco's tone was so firm she felt its pressure. His expression was one of perfect resolve. I've said everything I planned to say on the matter, if you recall. I do. She closed the door on that subject and opened the next. What about Scorpius? Our friends? If Hermione was being honest, she would confess her forming list of reservations. But they were still organizing themselves, not yet ready for vocalization. I don't propose keeping secrets, but I also don't believe we should make it public knowledge unless we're absolutely certain. No secrets. Should someone find out, that's fine. We aren't hiding, but I prefer to keep this between us. Hermione absently swept her thumb in the groove between his fingers. That goes for Scorpius as well. He is my biggest worry in all this. It hasn't been a year yet since... And we don't know what he's thinking or how he'll feel. He's made too much progress to be set back by any major changes. I wouldn't want to... I agree. Draco's words were accompanied by a shift of their joined hands from her leg to his. He is and always will be my primary concern in everything I do. He is also one of the reasons I'm affording you time to sort through everything you need to. You should do the same. I already have. Hermione blinked several times, rapidly, her brain speeding up to match the pounding in her chest. She jolted when a pop of lightning punctuated his loaded statement, and a clap of thunder soon followed. But the exchange left her more rattled and unsure than the chaos beyond the walls. Needing space, but unable to move to find it, she stayed still, silent, pensive. Speaking of Scorpius, Skeeter's article wasn't in the Morning Prophet when I glanced. I believe it will be in the evening edition for maximum effect, as it is distributed near the end of the workday. Nevertheless, I have time between meetings and wouldn't mind if you brought him to my office. It sounded casual, but the underlying weight of his statement, of his trust, was there. For lunch? Yes, to make up for my early departure yesterday. He appeared disappointed. Hermione smiled at the memory of the haul Scorpius had excitedly presented to his father, but it faded when she remembered how the high of his accepted offerings had ended. He had just wanted his dad to come back. Teddy had kept him distracted, but his smile hadn't quite reached his eyes the rest of the day. He was, but he'll be thrilled to see where you work. If you don't mind, I have to stop by Neville's greenhouse beforehand, and I think he'd love to see it. He would. There was a clench along his jaw and a flash of paternal warmth Hermione associated with each time she caught Draco watching Scorpius greet his cactus. Quiet settled between them, one that stretched beyond comfort to something akin to growing intimacy. Hermione searched for the better word to describe the feeling, but none fit. She tried to say something else, but her lips remained still. Slowly, she lost each prior thread of thought and worry in the warmth radiating from him, but she hung on to one. Perhaps, Draco, Since we're discussing rules, you should call me Hermione. I could. He inclined his head as if considering it. But I prefer Granger. She looked away with a smile, but caught the passage of time in a single glance. I should start breakfast. Cooking helped clear her mind of frivolities, allowing room for contemplation. Mixing the ingredients and seasonings to create the perfect flavor helped her relax. Once Narcissa's vegetable frittatas were baking, and she began making breakfast for herself and Scorpius, Hermione glanced from her task to Draco. As always, he was completing his crossword with his offensive pen and black frames perched on his nose. Every one of her carefully built thoughts crumbled. Doubt made Hermione want to talk herself out of everything they'd established that morning, but each glance stuttered the urge to a halt. There was no reason to panic. This was just experimentation in human form. A test. The same kind a gardener would perform on the soil to measure the physical, chemical, and biological properties necessary to determine if it could sustain life. Conversation and time, precious to both of them, neither had much to spare. You're going to burn your eggs overthinking. Which she had. With an aggravated wave of her wand, she vanished the mess. A ghost of a smirk played at the corner of his lips before it vanished too. But when she finished, and their plates were waiting for them at the table under charms, Hermione took a quick glance at what was left of his crossword, and didn't wait before pointing out that 7 across was Renoir. Draco placed his pen on the seam of his book and turned to her. The action brought them face to face. He leaned just a fraction shy of too close. I know. Signs of life in the form of an opening door pulled them away, and time continued on. The bedroom door opened and Sax stepped out, shutting it behind her with a grim expression. She's in a mood. Likely the same one from breakfast. The previous night's argument had led to a silent standoff between mother and son. Both had ignored the other's presence over the shared meal. Surprisingly, Scorpius hadn't noticed, but that was likely because their established level of interaction was little to none anyway. He'd eaten in his new chair, between them, which had turned awkward when Narcissa moved from the head of the table to directly across from them. When he'd finished, Scorpius offered his grandmother a stilted bow before letting Hermione fix his collar and turning to answer his father's only signed question with one word, yes. Once gone, any chance of mediation had dissolved to ash. Draco had excused himself, leaving for work with a look that lingered. If Narcissa noticed anything was out of the ordinary, she hadn't mentioned it once while irritably ranting about her son after his departure. Hermione hadn't engaged. It was better that way. The slight uptick of incidents of confusion and forgetfulness brought Hermione's initial battery of tests from nearly 4 months ago back into focus. It was time for an update. Does she have any appearances after this? Hermione had a parchment with her previous results in hand, along with a blank one for today's readings. No. Truly for the best, given Narcissa's foul mood. Everything took twice as long. She was slow to comply every step of the way. Hermione's patience remained intact throughout the process, but it was wearing thin when her patient accidentally apparated across the room following the final test. After calling for Sax, Hermione kept her calm enough for Sax to check on her for any signs of splinching. There were none. A quarter vial of calming draught later, and they both breathed a sigh of relief when Narcissa fell asleep. Thank you, Sax. No, thank you. She was earnest, even if reluctantly so. Given the highs and lows of the last few months, I doubt Keating and I would have known what to do had you not come along with your research. I guess that makes us a team. Hermione smiled and laid a warm hand on the witch's shoulder. I have an errand regarding ingredients for the experimental potion. Lunch is already prepared for her should she wake in time. I can handle it from there. With a nod, Hermione left. Odd was the only word that could describe the sight that greeted her in the living room. The cactus wasn't on its stand, moved instead to the coffee table in front of where Scorpius and Catherine sat on the sofa. They were each facing each other, one leg tucked in front, while the other rested on the floor, or dangled in Scorpius's case. She wasn't testing him, speaking various words from what appeared to be Hermione's sign language book while he answered with his hands. What day is it? He got tripped up on the question and frowned, thinking. The expression was familiar. His little eyebrows were furrowed, face scrunched, and tongue absently peeking out from his mouth. But then Scorpius signed a question all by himself, and Catherine cheered for his success. It really put joy in Hermione's heart to see how quickly he'd taken to this method of communication. There was still a long way to go. The journey wasn't nearly over, but that particular leg felt like years instead of months. Hermione could secretly confess she didn't miss the detached little boy she'd met in Theo's office in March, the one who suppressed his own tears. She ached for him, yes, but she was happy he was disappearing. Hermione was excited for what was to come. The growth, the changes, the continued blossoming. Scorpius's wave propelled her into motion, and Hermione joined them, taking the spot on the sofa he'd abandoned in order to sit between them. He turned to face her, waiting patiently while she thought of a test question. "Do you know how to sign when something is wrong?" He did just that. "Excellent!" The praise made his cheeks pink. "We were going to wait for you." Catherine shifted on the sofa. "But we finished morning lessons early, and he wanted to practice signing everything he's learned so far. He's trying to find a special sign for you, Miss Granger." It was an idea she'd implanted after Scorpius struggled to find the sign to communicate his worry for her. Hermione hadn't known he was working on it. His sulk about his exposed secret was potent, and Scorpius began to show signs of restlessness, but his shift in mood didn't last. She made a face which caused the little boy's frown to even, his expression settling into something bashful when she offered her hands. "Take your time, Scorpius. There's no rush." Hermione didn't want there to be another thing to make him anxious. Names were important, but ultimately it was a choice. His choice. "Whatever name you choose for me will be brilliant, and I'll love it because you've chosen it for me." Scorpius squeezed her fingers, his cheeks still pink, and he didn't let go. "Mr. Malfoy advised me of your plans." Catherine broke the silence. Drawing both of their attentions, Scorpius scooted closer to her. "And I thought I would change him into something more casual, but he only elected for a change in bow tie." "Very handsome." It was paisley green, and he looked very proud of his choice. "Speaking of plans, we should get ready to leave. Scorpius, please take your cactus back to its home." He obediently did just that, but not before giving Hermione a chance to say goodbye to it. She expected him to give Catherine the same option, but he merely shot her a suspicious look and went to return the plant back to its stand. "What happened there?" Hermione raised a brow at the younger witch. "In fairness to me, it looked dry." Not a good way to start, but she listened. "I was about to water it with my wand when Scorpius all but threw himself in front of it to stop me." The little boy gave her another distrustful look from across the room. Hermione tried to cover her chuckle with a cough. "I fear I've lost faith with that one." "We have a strict watering schedule. I should have told you." Hermione smiled at Scorpius when he returned. He stood at her side, and she absently rested her hand on the back of his head. "He's pretty protective of his friend." Scorpius nodded. "I learned that lesson swiftly." "When do his afternoon lessons start?" "Today? At 2. It was just after 10:30. Plenty of time. After Catherine left, Hermione made lunch, charmed each package to remain fresh, and packed them away with some snacks, just in case Scorpius got peckish. He helped the entire time, standing on a stool she'd transfigured, and sampling a few chopped carrots. He tried hummus for the first time and didn't like it. She could tell by his scrunched-up face his distaste likely had to do with the texture. Hermione mentally added it to the growing no list. "Are you ready?" Scorpius took her offered hand as an answer and jumped off the small stool. Off they went to the flue. Their first stop was Neville's. In particular, his greenhouse, which was on the campus of the magical university where he taught. It was summer, and the campus was mostly quiet. The walk from the public flue to the greenhouse was quick, given the cloudy skies that threatened more rain, but Hermione slowed her pace because she had a little tourist with her, and he looked wide-eyed and eager. From the statues to the fountain to the tall trees, everything grabbed his attention until they eventually reached their destination. The classical music Neville played for the plants was the only sign Hermione needed to know he was inside. His greenhouse was extensive, on a vastly different scale from hers, a larger version of what she hoped hers might become in the future. Closer to the greenhouse from Hogwarts, it could be a dangerous place, so Hermione stopped to prepare the confused little boy for his trip inside. For safety. Hermione helped him put on mittens, goggles, and oversized blue earmuffs she quickly spelled to fit him comfortably. He looked like a lovable alien. The goggles made his blue eyes appear extra large, and he held his hands out in front of him as if he wasn't certain what to do with them. While he got used to the loss of use of his hands, Hermione put on her own protective gear before drawing his attention. You mustn't touch anything unless I say so, okay? Scorpius obediently nodded, but he still seemed confused about the concept of mittens over gardening gloves as he bent and flexed his fingers. Ready? They were greeted by warmth, humidity, music, and organized greenery as they entered the greenhouse. Vivid and colorful, Scorpius halted a few steps inside the door that had shut on its own behind them. Mouth open and forming a small O, his eyes grew even wider. Hermione gave him a moment to absorb the beauty of the sight and look around at everything that was unfamiliar to him. It's beautiful, yes? Scorpius bobbed his mitted fist and held onto her hand tighter, as tight as he could. He looked like he wanted to touch the mundane plants nearest him, but never made a move, just observed. Let's find Neville. Hermione slowly led the little boy on, carefully watching out for him as his eyes scanned everything except what was ahead. Hermione found Neville watering a table of mandrakes towards the back. Hey, Hermione. He smiled in greeting, not at all surprised to see her. His surprise was reserved for her companion, who he greeted with a bright grin before squatting before him. And who do we have here? This is Scorpius Malfoy. His friend's question was visible, and she pointedly ignored it. I'm Neville Longbottom, he said with a laugh, extended a hand. Pleasure to meet you, Scorpius. The little boy looked at her first in question. Well, she had told him not to touch anything. You can, but only if you want. Scorpius, who would have normally bowed, opted out of the handshake, but offered a wave instead, a bashful one. He stepped closer to Hermione, 1 second from hiding behind her. Neville was good-natured and kind, so he just gave the boy another wide smile, but they all heard a noise and Scorpius's attention went back to the world around him. He likes plants. Plenty of those here. Neville stood to his full height and stepped out of Scorpius's way so he could continue enjoying everything. And he did, but the little boy never let go. Luna's around. They followed him through the rows at the meandering pace, stopping to identify each plant that drew Scorpius's attention. They paused frequently, but found Luna soon enough. Not that it was hard. She was dressed in bright pink overalls with a white shirt with smiling watermelons that danced. She looked thoughtful in a way only Luna could, hand on her chin, looking back and forth between 2 plants that stood taller than her and Hermione. I don't think they like each other. Then she turned, smiling at her and Neville, then down at Scorpius. Oh, hello, Hermione and Tiny Human. Like most children were fascinated by shiny objects, Scorpius had a similar reaction to Luna. There was something about her that drew people in, especially children. She never had to say or do anything special. She was just Luna. Bizarrely logical and able to see the world in a way Hermione never could. It had taken her a long time to truly respect that, but she did. When Luna offered him her hand to give him the grand tour, Scorpius looked to Hermione for permission. She granted it before he approached and accepted the invitation, eyes locked on Luna. His expression was somewhere between confusion and wonder, which was very appropriate for the entire situation. What would you like to see first? Hermione started to remind her of Scorpius's silence, but as always, Luna surprised her by offering her gloved hand. Will you show me? Once they ventured out of earshot, hand in hand, their first stop was at the lavender plants. Hermione watched her friend crouch down next to him and talk to him about the plant. A smile curved her lips. Are we going to talk about that? If you're going to be annoying, at least wait until I complete the purpose of my visit. Very well, then. Hermione pulled out the list of potential binding agents and the herbs that they would need to create them in order to taste Draco's potion. He wanted to begin experimental brews to find the proper binding ingredients in the next few weeks, and now that she had mostly finished sorting through his extensive research, Hermione was in agreement. Brewing involved more preparation than actual work. It could take months to find the right binding agent. She was tasked with gathering each potential ingredient and making sure she could maintain the quality needed should any of them work. I've marked the ones I already have, and the ones we can acquire on our own, but here. Neville checked the list. I have a couple of these. You want the entire plants? If you can spare them. If not, I'll take a clipping if you'll prepare them for cultivation. Okay, I can bring them by this weekend. Perfect. They stood in silence. Scorpius and Luna were still moving on, rounding the corner that took them out of their direct sight for a moment before they reappeared on the next aisle. He looked around, but didn't touch. One little hand was still securely in Luna's, while the other was tucked behind him. Hard to believe that's Malfoy's son. You'd be surprised how alike they are. I remember Daphne saying he didn't speak, but that was months ago. It's still true. He spoke to Teddy last week and possibly Albus, so perhaps he only speaks to children. Draco and I discussed... Hermione caught Neville regarding her with question in his eyes. Several of them. What? You called him Draco. I don't understand why everyone insists on pointing out the way in which we refer to each other. Do you like him? As a person? When Neville's grin turned playful, Hermione sharpened her suspicious glare. You've been talking to Ginny. Actually, Luna has. Everyone has opinions. She rolled her eyes. Go on, tell me yours. Complex history aside, I think they're just excited that you're interested in someone. Anyone. Neville led the way to another plant on her list, going through each before settling on one that he could spare. It was arguably the best of the bench. As for me, I have no opinions on this. I'm just waiting to see what you'll decide to do. Force them out or let them in. That particular conversation had vanished from her memory, until now. Luna and Scorpius were officially out of sight. I've never seen you so involved. I'm plenty involved with Teddy and with Harry's kids. Besides, Scorpius is here by happenstance. He loves plants, and I needed to stop by, so I brought him here for the experience. Actually, I'm talking about Malfoy. Neville's eyes slid to hers. Harry told me that he asked you to stay with his family after the Godric's Hollow attack. It was the only logical option, considering I'm... Neville's chuckle made her stop. You're in denial, Hermione, and this is entertaining. Carry on. There was nothing to be in denial about, but she didn't feel like arguing or explaining the strange newness between her and Draco. So she didn't, following him instead on his search for the second plant on her list. It was ideal that he was able to offer entire plants instead of clippings. By the time they made their way around the greenhouse, everything was crossed off except the last three options. He gave her a quick lesson on how to care for them, when to dry the seeds or leaves for brewing, and how often she should harvest each. Hermione took notes. As they were finishing up, Luna returned with Scorpius, who carried a small bundle of pink carnations in his mitted hands and an eager expression. He seemed slightly nervous, yet overall relaxed, much like he'd been in her vegetable patch. The environment, the freedom, and the company did wonders for him. Was your tour fun? A smile was his only response before he peered up at Luna. We walked around, and I told him what all the plants were, and what the flowers meant. Seemed like he wanted to know, like he was looking for something. Luna smiled down at the boy. I let him pick a few flowers to keep for himself. But instead of holding on, Scorpius extended the bundle to her with the same insistent look he'd worn while giving his father an armful of freshly picked vegetables. This was for her, what he wanted her to have, what he'd been looking for. Hermione accepted the gift and the hug around her waist that accompanied it. Thank you. After Scorpius waved goodbye to Luna, Neville walked them to the door and left her with a comment. Pink carnation. Interesting choice. They mean gratitude, yes, but it's interesting that something so beautiful can have the same meaning as something as prickly as a cactus. A mother's love. The atrium was busy as always. Scorpius held her hand a little tighter, a sign that she was bothered, and Hermione winced at her lack of foresight. She should have entered through a private flue. After steering the overwhelmed-looking child to a spot away from the throngs of people, she found both her wand and the same earmuff she'd used to cover his ears in Neville's greenhouse, then handed him the flowers so that he could have something else to hold on to. Scorpius blinked a few times, not when she covered his ears, but after spelling them to dull the sound of the busy atrium. He seemed much more comfortable after that, more engaged with his surroundings. The Fountain of Magical Brethren, large and grand, grabbed his attention. There were employees sitting on the edge, talking amongst themselves while subtly pointing at her until they noticed Scorpius walking in front of them, staring up. They smiled and cooed words he couldn't hear. Hermione trailed after him, and when he nearly bumped into two people due to inattentiveness, she apologized profusely. Not that she needed to. His awe endeared him to everyone in the area. She found herself wondering if they would still think him adorable if they knew he was a Malfoy. If they knew who his father was. Maybe yes, but likely no. There would be some preconceived ideas about him and Hermione. As she held on to Scorpius while he reached out to touch the water, she could see the pure joy on his face, see the innocence people would frown upon, hear the way some people would judge him without knowing the first thing about him, and she hated it. Hated that at one point in her life she had been no better than anyone else. Scorpius looked at her over his shoulder, and he must have seen her expression because he stopped reaching and turned, looking concerned. Hermione smiled and thumbed between his eyes to smooth over his scrunched brows. He hopped down off the side, but only after accepting her hand. For the crowd, the line to check her wand wasn't long. No more than 5 minutes later, and they were waiting in the queue. Scorpius observed everything and made her wonder if he'd ever been around so many people before. Had Hermione not been so focused on him, smiling fondly at how cute he was with his oversized earmuffs, she would have noticed the moment someone stepped a little too close. Hermione Granger. Shite. Cormac McLaggen. She took a patient breath before glancing at him. What do you want? I just happened to be returning from lunch. Imagine my surprise when I saw you in the ministry. Not on your typical day or at your normal time. One might call your appearance suspicious, given everything that's happening. Still assigned to keep tabs on me? Until the Restoration conspirators are found, I'm back to being an errand boy. His jaw twitched, a sign of his increasing irritation with her, but it smoothed back into its usual leer. I think my uncle will be curious about your presence. His arm brushed hers, and she stepped away in a careful move that didn't draw attention. One might say your presence was on purpose. An odd statement, but Hermione didn't nibble on the bait. I'm not certain how visiting an employee for lunch is an act that warrants scrutiny. My uncle would beg to differ. From our last interaction, I thought your uncle would have learned his lesson to leave me alone. Why would he? Cormac's voice lowered. You threatened his position, the minister, and the entire Wizengamot. There are eyes on you, Hermione, and they are waiting for your next move. He wants to squash you and the attention you bring. I don't understand why the Chief Warlock is wasting his time on a healer instead of performing the duties of his job. But there are several things in life I can't make sense of. The next lift was nearly there. Oh, and I didn't threaten him. You see, I'm in no official position to do so, but I did promise to hold anyone corrupt accountable. She rested a finger on her chin. Now that I think about it, I suppose your initial statement was correct. With the arrival of the lift, the queue moved. There wasn't enough room for her and Scorpius, so she waited, and unfortunately, McLaggen didn't take the last spot. In a show of faux kindness, he let the witch behind him take it. She rewarded him with a pretty smile that he held until the lift was gone. Then it vanished. And it wasn't until it was gone that he glanced over, then down, one eyebrow raising. She followed his line of sight to Scorpius, who, oh, Merlin. She'd never seen him look like that before. Brow scrunched, mouth pursed. It was the closest impression of his father that she'd ever seen from him, but the vision was endearing when combined with his earmuffs and stained cheeks. What's your name? Scorpius's glare darkened as he stepped forward with a boldness that opposed how he'd greeted Neville. Children were an excellent judge of character, and this one sure as hell didn't like Cormac. Oi there! Are you her protector? Cormac's teasing tone made Scorpius scowl. The next lift arrived, and Hermione led the way. She put herself against the back wall with Scorpius in front of her, and placed her hands on his shoulders. He offered her the carnations he'd been holding for her hand, and she accepted them. He almost smiled before he caught Cormac watching, and it vanished behind a sneer. The lift was nearly empty after the first stop. Cormac wasn't the only person bemused by Scorpius's expression. A stranger broke the silence in the small space. "Aw, he's protecting his mummy." Bless his earmuff, Scorpius didn't hear the comment, but Hermione did, and she still shook her head. "I'm not his mum." "Whose son is he?" Cormac's interest increased tenfold. "He's not Harry's." Blessedly, the doors to the lift opened on the right floor, and Hermione guided Scorpius out towards Harry's office. Hermione needed Dolores' help to find a way to Draco's office, and she wanted to get to their destination quickly should anyone else appear, like Tiberius. She would have made it had Scorpius not slowed her down by looking over his shoulder and glowering. He appeared so distracted that Hermione turned as well. Cormac was following them. Great. No sense in hurrying. He would catch them in no less than 20 long strides. Hermione stopped, turned to face her problem head on, gently gripping Scorpius's tense shoulder. "Can I help you, Cormac?" He looked from her to the little boy at her side. "Whose kid, Hermione?" "I know you didn't follow me to ask that question. That information is none of your business." "No, I've followed you to accompany you both to Harry's office, assuming that's where you're going." "I am, but no thanks. I have all the company I need." He stepped closer. "Might I remind you that you no longer work here?" "I have a visitor's badge and a checked wand." She glared at him but kept her tone calm. "Any other excuses for stalking?" "You need a guide." "I can take it from here, thank you." A cool, perfectly even voice rose from behind them. Everyone turned, and there stood Draco, looking every bit as in control as his voice sounded. But there was a purposeful edge in every step of his approach. For once, it wasn't reserved for Hermione. Only Cormac. "Malfoy," Cormac greeted once Draco stood at Hermione's side. The seconds ticked on in silence, each squaring their shoulders in a way that made them seem taller, bigger. Draco was slightly shorter, but no one bothered to inform him of this. "I was just accompanying Hermione, and—" Cormac looked down at Scorpius, who had stopped glaring in favor of staring at his father, before his eyes lifted back to Draco in recognition. "Is he—" "I said I can take it from here." There was a professional brusqueness in Draco's tone, an appearance not many had perfected. Hermione paid no mind to the bit of heat she felt on her face and neck from the crispness of his words. "Hermione is going to Harry's office, so I'll accompany her there. They're both here to visit me." Cormac blinked several times. "Apologies." Draco was no longer speaking to him, but to her. A smooth calmness that bordered on politeness. She was confused. They hadn't set a specific time. Oh. Understanding dawned on her of what he was trying to accomplish. "Nothing to apologize for." Hermione angled her body towards Draco, mindful of Scorpius. "We were delayed by the fountain." "I also wasn't expecting you both this early. I didn't open my Floo." "I forgot that I didn't have the option to Floo directly into your office from our first stop." She held up the small bundle of carnations as indication of where they'd been. After a single nod of acknowledgement, Draco made a polite gesture. "Shall we?" Cormac was still looking back and forth between them, his frown deepening with each pass. "Are you two— What business do you have?" Draco's voice was chilly. "No business at all, besides my own personal interest. I will say this is intriguing." Cormac gestured between the two of them, his frown shifting into something else, something darker. "And explains a lot. I think your presence is required elsewhere." And then Draco did something none of them expected. He picked his son up like he weighed nothing. The expression on Scorpius's face was one of shock and priceless confusion. Hermione almost laughed until she felt a hand on her lower back steering her in the direction of his office. Then his hand found hers as he led the way. Just as stunned as Scorpius, she quietly went along with it. "Is he gone?" Hermione looked over her shoulder, still watching. His hand stayed in hers until they rounded the corner, then it returned to his side. "Rumors will be all over the ministry by the end of the day." "I'll handle it." A statement so firm Hermione didn't argue. She guessed Draco finally realized how far he'd abruptly deviated from his routine with Scorpius because his son was blatantly staring at him. Because they were face to face. Because he'd picked him up. While awake. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Scorpius's shock and confusion bled into something warm and kind. He dimpled to smile, and the frosty expression on Draco's face thawed slightly, then more when Scorpius smoothed the space between his father's brows, just like Hermione had done earlier. Fond amusement weaved itself into a genuine smile that made Hermione's heart swell. Oh. Then the moment ended. Draco's face evened back to his default. She was watching him, openly bearing witness to a moment she would never forget. After adjusting Scorpius on his arm, his good one, she noted, he faced her. "I wasn't expecting you both this early." "The greenhouse trip didn't take very long. Are you ready for lunch?" Draco glanced at his hopeful son. "I can be." Draco's office was in the back, and it seemed that they passed every member of the task force along the way. Conversation stopped abruptly. Work halted. Even a meeting behind a glass wall paused at the sight of a stern-looking Draco Malfoy carrying an ear-muffed-wearing little boy. Everyone stared unabashedly. Hermione walked behind him, making certain to keep her flowers at her side, and her expression just as impassive as his. No hint of awareness or embarrassment. Nothing to see. She did, however, see Scorpius awkwardly wave over his dad's shoulder at a small gaggle of witches from the French task force who waved back at him. He didn't smile, just buried his head in the crook of Draco's neck, shy from the attention. The whispering conversations and ogling resumed as soon as they were out of earshot. Surely they had work to do. Hermione cleared her throat, and when she looked back, Draco was holding his office door open. Both father and son were regarding her with similar expressions. Wordlessly, she tucked her hair behind her ears and walked in. Draco's office was a blank slate, devoid of anything that would identify it as his. There was one lone bookshelf with a few books on each row, and the larger ones crowded near the bottom. All it meant was that this was a place he didn't think of as his, not like his home office. The only comparison between the two spaces was his desk, which was respectfully cluttered. There was one oddity, though, a dirty potato perched on the corner. Hermione's face warmed from the token kept by a man who showed so little himself. The door shut with an audible click, and Draco's first order of business was to put his son down and try to sort a spot for lunch. Scorpius began to approach Hermione, but the vegetable called to him like a moth to a flame, and after touching it, he looked to his father for explanation. Only Draco had his back turned. "You kept it?" The question made Draco's head whip to her, then over to Scorpius, who was holding the memento. It spelled not to rot. Scorpius placed it back in its spot as carefully as he had the cactus not long ago. The bookshelf caught his attention next, and he approached it while his father cleared away his work to give them a spot to eat. "Is there anything he can't touch?" Draco looked up from stacking parchments and set them aside. "They're regular books." Scorpius turned his head, asking Hermione a question with his eyes. "One book, but only after we eat." Hilariously, he considered the instruction before appearing to deem it fair with a nod and returning to her side. Once Draco's desk was clean, she pulled a chair around to sit next to him and unpacked their lunches. Another problem presented itself. Draco's office was small, and he didn't have enough space for the extra chair they needed, which was how Scorpius ended up sitting on his father's desk, earmuff-free, with his feet dangling off the side. He seemed pleased in a muted way that was all him. Lunch consisted of roasted chicken sandwiches for her and Draco, cheese toasties, sliced fruit, and vegetables that Scorpius went for first. Malfoy was puzzled. "I thought he liked cheese toasties." "He's a picky eater, so he saves what he wants best for last." Hermione bit her own sandwich and lunch officially commenced. Scorpius ate slowly, happily, but halfway through, he did something unexpected. He began sharing with his father. First a cucumber slice, then a carrot, then a strawberry. Scorpius ate one piece, then offered the next to his father, who always accepted. But when Draco offered Scorpius a slice of his tangerine in return, the look on the boy's face changed, reminding her of a day he'd made a similar offer to Albus. Friendship. He accepted the slice and saved it for last, even after the toasties. The best. Scorpius's first trip following the meal was to the bookshelf. He, of course, picked the largest book he could find. Hermione doubted it had pictures. When he wobbled once, the man next to her shifted in his chair, adjusting in the event he needed to make a quick grab to stop his son from falling over. Admirable, but Scorpius stubbornly remained on his feet, and placed the book on the blanket Draco had transfigured for him. Before he sat to flip through the pages, Scorpius returned to her side, hands open for the earmuffs she'd taken off. He happily put them back on, finding peace in the silence. Unknowingly, he gave them the perfect opportunity to talk. "From McLaggen?" Draco stiffly gestured to the carnations he had been glancing at on and off during the meal. "Gods, no! As if I would accept such a gift from him." Hermione picked them up and noted how fresh they still were. Perhaps Luna had charmed them not to wilt. "These were picked by Scorpius at Neville's greenhouse. He gave them to me." "Oh." There was a small shift in his demeanor. Curious. Do you prefer flowers?" It wasn't just that she was visibly startled by his question. Hermione very much was. Her surprise was more about the way he watched her after, as if reading her for clues that might linger underneath her answer. It was easier to deflect. But defensiveness wasn't present in the small space of his office, only honesty. I'm no good at accepting gifts or anything, really. I can admit that. Begrudgingly, of course. But I do believe gifts should be from the heart and have meaning. Purpose? His elbow was on the arm of the chair, his chin in his palm, watching her with clear interest. Whether for brewing and consumption, caring for patients or those you know, nothing in your greenhouse or garden is there for aesthetics. It's true. Hermione touched the flowers gently. The purpose of a flower is to attract pollinators to aid in fertilization, but it doesn't make them any less beautiful or meaningful in their own right. She let the comment marinate as their gazes traveled to Scorpius, who seemed to be enjoying himself, or so she hoped. He looked like he was studying for an exam, and the way he frowned, as if deeply concentrating, was both amusing and a bit strange. The book is in dead language that he can't read just yet. Oh. At some point, he would learn those things as part of his education. Hermione's opinions on that weren't as visceral now that she had seen Draco's translation efforts. Through Scorpius, she was also reminded of the importance of communication and preserving language. Languages were human creations. They were born, developed, declined, and perished. A life cycle that occurred fluidly throughout the course of history. Each person spoke in their own way. Perhaps extending the lives of a few lost languages wasn't such a bad idea. With an internal shrug, Hermione stood and began packing everything back into her bag, while Draco went to his desk and pulled out a note for her that she accepted once his desk was clear of any evidence of their meal. These are the talking points I made with my mother during our discussion about her care. Argument was more apt, but Hermione wisely held her tongue. You should review them and compare them to your own notes. Good idea. When we talk to her together, we'll both be on the same footing. A better one, hopefully. Perhaps. His response was clipped, but also resigned and astonishingly placid. When would you like to make another attempt? In a few days. Very well. With nothing else to busy herself, Hermione took her seat again. Draco did the same shortly after. It was hard to tell what was on his mind. Hermione tried and failed. It's unlikely I'll be home for dinner tonight. I imagine Skeeter's article will be out in the evening edition, and it will be chaotic. Draco spoke of the impending media circus as if entirely unconcerned. Percy and I will be meeting to discuss our strategy. Scorpius should be asleep before I return. Is that why you asked me to bring him here? He didn't answer, only moved to take her hand. Warm, masculine, easy to hold. Given this was the third time he'd done it, Hermione began to wonder about the significance of the gesture for him. Time passed as Hermione's understanding of him struggled under the weight of their recent developments. She had building questions. They stacked on top of each other, one after the next, but perhaps there was no need to push. Draco would express himself when he felt the need to. That had been his way thus far. And now wasn't the right time to push any boundaries, so Hermione embraced the silence of her surroundings, glancing at Draco as he watched Scorpius studiously flip through the pages of a book even she couldn't read. Will you eat dinner? Likely with Percy. Okay. Hermione shifted in her chair. I'll be working in your office when you get back then. We can... talk? Court? Hermione gave an awkward shrug that earned her a raised brow. Not sure what to call it. Spend time together? That sounds accurate. How are you so rational about this? Your denial gave me time to think. The corner of his mouth twitched a little. Once. Twice. The question of the hour was how much? She doubted Draco would answer, which was fine. The morning paper on his desk caught her attention. The headlines sang the praises of the ministry. Hermione sighed. The prophet would be printing a different truth later. Before knowing the extent of the fallout from the prophet's article, I should really discuss my plans to approach Kingsley. I'm certain Percy is curious. He didn't have much success. Or any at all. I haven't exactly figured out what to say. She crossed her ankles. Kingsley is... I'm fully aware of how he is. That wasn't what Hermione expected, and she raised an eyebrow at the revelation. Have you met him? Only once. Draco stared ahead. After my trial. What did he say? Draco didn't speak for a long moment. Forgiveness, repentance, and atonement are all different. If you work all three out for yourself, I have hope that the next time I see you, you will be a better man. That sounded like Kingsley. Wise words from a poignant man who saw things others couldn't see in themselves. Have you seen him since?
No. They made one more quick stop by Hermione's home to find a vase for her carnations. Once she'd gotten Scorpius settled, she stepped outside for a short conversation with Goldstein, whose team was taking advantage of the small break in the storm and working under the watchful wands of Aurors. By the time she found Scorpius again, it felt far later than noon. He'd answered sleep's warm call by bundling himself up in a blanket on the chaise in the conservatory with his sock-covered feet poking out. He looked more than comfortable, too adorable to disturb, so she let him sleep. The day had already been eventful, and there was still time before his afternoon lessons for him to reset. Scorpius left enough room for her to join him, and when she did, he unconsciously snuggled close, mumbling unintelligibly, until she hummed and combed her fingers through his hair. In no time at all, he fell asleep, breathing deeply. Comfort was found in the smallest of gestures. Hermione continued reading Persuasion until someone unexpectedly came through her flue. Cho. Bookmarking her place and untangling from Scorpius without waking him was no easy feat. By the time she did both, her visitor was approaching with a gift bag and wearing a pleasant smile that slightly faded upon seeing the little boy. She stopped mid-step. "Oh, I didn't know you—" "I was just reading while he napped. He has about 20 minutes left before he needs to be back for his afternoon lessons." Hermione picked up her wand and set a privacy charm, gesturing to the sofa close by. Her presence wasn't accidental. Cho never turned up without Padma, or the promise of girls' night to de-stress from the week. After joining the other witch, Hermione took in her casual appearance, noting the display of her nerves and her curled fists, and the way she looked everywhere except Hermione. "I'll confess, I'm surprised to see you here." "Sorry." Cho ran a hand through her dark hair. "Your flue was open, so I came through thinking you were free." She picked up the bag she'd placed on the table. "This is for you." "What is it?" "A peace offering." I didn't know we were in need of such a gesture. Hermione's acceptance of the gift was slow. "We're not in the middle of a war." "No, but—" The shuffling sounds of Scorpius turning over made Cho peek at where he remained asleep. "Is that Draco Malfoy's son?" "Yes." Hermione folded her arms, hoping Cho would get to the point of her visit and put an end to the stilted air between them. She didn't. "Oh." Cho stared at her hands on her lap, and the awkwardness continued. "I've heard a lot about him, but I've never met him." "I'm not saying this to be rude, but I'm curious about why you're here." "To apologize about what I said after brunch. In the loo." The sigh Cho exhaled was an unusual one, some strange mixture of sadness and frustration. "I've been feeling bad since it happened. I'm not that person, but I felt I had to say something. I realized as soon as I left that I shouldn't have said anything. I asked Padma for advice, and she told me to talk to you directly, so here I am." When the silence stretched too thin, Hermione rested a hand on her arm. "Are you here to talk about it?" "Yes, but it's difficult." Cho focused on the world beyond the glass as she steeled herself. "I stand by my statement that I was trying to help you. I meant no harm." "Then why do you feel guilty?" I may have projected my own situation onto you. I saw the signs, and I wanted to give you a warning because I wish I'd had one before. Well, in a new light. I don't think I was being fair." "Fair to who?" "You." Cho seemed to settle into the impending conversation, crossing her legs and looking directly at her. "I don't know the extent of your relationship with Draco Malfoy. I only know from the bits that I've heard about you two getting closer. I might have misspoke, but in the event that I didn't, I wanted to make sure that you were careful." "Why?" "He's lost his wife. The process of grieving is significantly different for every individual. Not to mention he has a son, and no one has the right to speak for him." "I'm not. I'll admit I don't know him that well. I was merely speaking of my own experience with a man who was affected by the same loss." Emotions swelled in her voice like the rising tide, giving Hermione the opportunity to identify each one. Anger, heartache, defeat, and exhaustion. Feelings long suppressed sprang forth. Cho was such a practical person that Hermione had only seen her angry for the first time at brunch. Seeing the woman visibly upset startled her into moving closer, and offering silent reprieve and comfort in the form of an arm around her shoulder. Time continued on as wordless tears slid down her flushed cheeks. Cho was embarrassed by her own feelings, batting the evidence away while apologizing profusely. Hermione accepted none of her apologies, validating her feelings with support that grew into a hug. "I'll listen if you want to talk." It should have known from the start it wouldn't end well. Numb stillness followed Hermione for the next set of hours, serving as a reminder that knowledge contained equal parts power and pain, as much as a blessing as it was a curse. 37 silent minutes into her meeting with Theo, Hermione felt both damned and liberated by wisdom, but also convinced of Theo's awareness of her agitation. He'd cleared his schedule, but didn't disrupt the quiet. Perhaps he was testing her, waiting to see how long she would wait. For this, an eternity. Rather than allow herself to be consumed, Hermione sorted and arranged and compartmentalized. It was the only thing that kept her from hurling questions and demanding answers. The only activity that kept her mind calm, serene. Exhaling a tiny breath, she continued her attempts to collect her thoughts. There were plenty. But this was a professional meeting, and Hermione had brought along a stack of folders to review, or simply stare at while replaying every word of a conversation that had lasted until Scorpius woke up on his own. She had apologized for being late to return him for the afternoon lessons, distracted instead by the memory of Scorpius staring at the stranger. Cho had only sobbed harder when he showed compassion in the small offer of one of Hermione's succulents. Cho. Her peace transported Hermione back to the beginning, back to this quiet man. And now he appeared to be less of a naughty enigma with cryptic advice and more human. Theo licked his fingertip before flipping to the next page in his book, glancing at her as if to give her an opportunity to break the silence. She opened her next set of folders, still staring blankly at the files in front of her. The move was met with an impressed eyebrow. He read on, and Hermione appeared to do the same, but she might as well have been reading one of those dead languages for all she absorbed. All she could think about was the hindsight found in hints, clues, and bits of conversations. She wished she'd known, but what good would that knowledge have been? What would it have changed? Nothing. Hermione almost hated the word she'd spoken so fluidly before. You've improved. I'm always learning. Hermione closed her folder and began strategizing as though they were playing a game of chess. Her first move was to let him set the tone. I understand why you use silence as a weapon. Or a means of defense. Theo gave her one of his knowing looks. It depends on the situation, the person I'm speaking to, or what I intend to accomplish. And what do you intend to accomplish today? Hermione waved her hand to pour them both a second cup of peppermint and rosemary blend he liked so much. A conversation, mainly, but also perhaps we can find answers to the questions I have. Funny, she had questions as well. Many. The collection of her questions grew larger, wider, and deeper, but Hermione calmed her mind, steadied herself. I'm surprised you haven't answered your own questions. Her following chuckle was strategic and served to determine how relaxed he was, very judging by the steady hand holding his tea and the small smile on his face. I have most of it figured out, true, but sometimes confirmation is key. Hermione took a sip from her teacup. Where would you like to start? There is a security briefing on Monday at 10 that you and the rest of the staff are required to attend. That was unexpected. Oh? Yes, there will be several topics of discussion. Theo sat straighter, sounding more official and less like a friend. You aren't here much, so this will be new information for you. The hospital has had 3 security breaches in the last month alone, so we've made changes to protocols as we investigate why these breaches keep occurring. What sort of breaches? Unauthorized personnel attempting to gain access to restricted areas. Suspicious boxes found inside the hospital where they don't belong. Every bit of evidence leads me to believe that there is a mole on staff. As a result, we've taken to screening everyone. Does the ministry know? No, but I've informed Hestia, Harry, and Draco. No one else. I've contracted the secrecy of those on important projects. The phrasing reminded her of a charmed parchment from her childhood. Good idea. In that case, the ends justify the means. Furthermore, we will be discussing everything we've learned about the airborne use of the poison, the proper charms to protect yourself, and distributing the new robes to protect against it should you come in contact with it. How is the production going for the antidote? Top secret, but between you and I, it's progressing. With the Wizengamot attempting to assist, what's the caveat? She already knew that their involvement meant there was one. They get a say in distribution, and it will be available to all ministry employees first. Hermione rolled her eyes at the corruption, counting down until a time when they wouldn't have to be in a resource competition with the people who were supposed to lead. We should be fully stocked by October. That's not soon enough. If Godric's Hollow has told us anything. I've been purchasing the antidote privately, and St. Mungo's is stocked for a small-scale attack, like the one at Godric's Hollow. But larger. Theo shook his head. How much have you brewed? Enough to cover everyone I know and myself, except Molly. She's already had the antidote, so she's immune to being poisoned again. Hermione's mind kicked into overdrive. I wonder if there's a way to take it prematurely, like a vaccine. Ideally, to test the theory, you would need a sample of the poison. The powdered form should have been present at both the Ministry attack and the Godric's Hollow. You're right. Theo paused and sat his tea down. I've been quietly having the research team attempt to replicate the poison with what was collected at both scenes. You're going to? I've had the idea for months. I just didn't have the poison available. Hermione sat back in her chair, letting everything sink in. Threats are coming to the hospital, the Ministry, and any place under the Ministry's control. Theo's statement made sense. The list was long because the Ministry's reach was wide. The full moon in August is on the 13th. Given what happened at your home, even though it happened outside your wards, I would err on the side of caution. I'm still staying with the Malfoys at this time. If everything is finished by then, I'll be certain to stay home or with Pansy. Even with her party on an undetermined day, the girls' group would likely kick off the celebration of her actual birthday that day. Speaking of Pansy, have you decided who you'll be going as? Colonel Brandon. A man with a tragic past who found love again. Hermione frowned, mouth tight. She exhaled. Now she was ready. I need you to be honest with me. At the seriousness of her tone, Theo offered his undivided attention by sitting straighter in his chair. It's not an easy topic to discuss, but Pansy and Ginny mentioned something that I found curious. Oh? Why do you have a pensieve? Theo's signs of tension were subtle, but Hermione paid attention to something she might have otherwise filed away for later. The shift in his demeanor, the change in the energy between them, the slight gleam in his eyes, the leveled expression. She'd struck gold, but only because she knew where it was. What do you know? One side of the story, but as your friend, I'd appreciate yours. Hermione folded her hands on the desk, catching the defensiveness she'd only seen when their topic drifted to things that mattered to him. This was personal. I respect you enough not to make judgments before I know facts. I appreciate that. He looked towards the window. Cho. She confided in me under the guise of being worried about my relationship with Draco mirroring her relationship with you. Hermione refused to discuss the fact that she'd sobbed on her floor for the better part of an hour. Does it? He stared at her from across the desk. No, as far as I know, his marriage was nothing more than a platonic partnership forged under a contract she took over after Daphne eloped with Dean. She did it to protect her family. That's no secret. Theo stood and went to the window, looking out. Maybe it was for tactical purposes, but Hermione had seen him in a different contemplative position in her conservatory, and wondered if it was easier for him to speak when he could focus on the horizon, or compare the different grays of the sky. What did she give up? Nothing. No. She didn't know why, but the word made her heart throb in pain. Hermione clenched her fist and exhaled. I don't believe that. According to Daphne, Astoria couldn't muster feelings for Draco during their marriage. Was that because of you? His lack of an answer was all the confirmation needed. Does Draco know? Before the question was even out, Hermione knew that answer too. She felt sick. It preceded their marriage and the war, if that's what you want to know. Not one-sided or unrequited. It was very much mutual. The quiet passion was evident in his tone as Theo told his truth. It wasn't going to last anyway. Why didn't you marry her before... Sins of the father. His chuckle was dry and filled with a type of sadness that burned. Hermione looked away, her stomach twisting with understanding of generational nature of punishment. The difference is that Draco and his family were exonerated. My father was not. It took years to bring my name out of the mud. Not that it would have mattered. After Daphne, she was all they had left, and they had already dedicated so much of their family's fortune to keep her alive. It went unsaid, but Hermione knew. They weren't able to pay the penalties of a broken contract. Astoria knew she wouldn't live a full life, but she was tired of their desperate attempts at curing her blood illness. So when Narcissa came along looking for penance, She saw an opportunity to fix all of their problems at once. Did she tell you beforehand? She did. Hermione couldn't imagine how that conversation went, but the hard look spoke only of pain. Did you... Hermione had to look away to ask the question. Did you love her? Enough to let her go. Enough to later promise to care for Scorpius and Draco after she was gone. Hermione shook her head, feeling heavier as she put the painful pieces together to see the exact shape of duty. Love was a powerful motivator, but so was memory. That promise to her made Theo prioritize a person who had caused Astoria years of unhappiness as Draco's wife. How he did so without spite or malice, Hermione didn't know. How are you friendly with Narcissa? How... My promise to Astoria overrides my feelings about Narcissa's treatment of her. I leave the quiet anger to Draco, and the louder spite to Daphne. I'm not a bitter man. How could you stand by and watch her marry someone she didn't love, then have a child? In another life, Scorpius could have been. Hermione couldn't fathom living with that sort of weight on her. The longing. I told you once that there are several things required for two people to form a connection, and a relationship status isn't one of them. Theo glanced over his shoulder at her. I meant that. We honored her vows. Draco knew from day one that he was committing to a life of nothing, and loneliness in certain aspects of that. Hermione took a deep breath and stared at her hands. They were locked together. Yes, he'd gotten a son and a friendship, which afforded a certain degree of intimacy. Perhaps that was more than Draco had expected, maybe less, but she remembered Daphne saying Astoria knew he needed more. Perhaps love? Affection? The ability to take off his mask, shed his armor, and truly be vulnerable with another person. Partnership should only be a facet of marriage, not the totality of it. But what did she know? Hermione wasn't well versed in love. Her experience was limited and lacking. Maybe her inexperience inflated her views into the realm of idealism. But what she did understand was the reason why Draco was stern in his unwillingness to settle for nothing again. Real. Genuine. The core of his expectations. The reason Draco gave her time and space. Why he took her hand. He was testing the simple luxury of reaching out and touching someone who might want to reach back. Touch in itself was a form of intimacy, a way of expressing oneself when words no longer held potency. Worry licked up the walls of her mind, flaring to life, but the flames were tempered by Theo and their unfinished conversation. Cho doesn't know everything. She knows enough, Theo. She told me you two were on and off for years in secret. She was there for you when you struggled, and then when you mourned the loss of another woman, someone else's wife, and you haven't stopped. Theo denied nothing. Despite it all, she cares for you and thinks you're a good man, one who is unavailable because you're stuck in the past with a pensieve of memories to keep you company. It's not that you can't let go. You just won't. I'm not ready. Never before had she heard him sound so earnest, so human. Hermione stood and joined him at the window. Now that Hermione's eyes were opened, Theo's pain was all she could see. She rested a gentle hand on his back for a moment of comfort, support for a friend who had once done the same when she was lost. I've realized that someone doesn't have to die in order for you to grieve their loss. Hermione peered up at her friend, who wouldn't look her in the eye. I think you've been grieving for years in the name of duty. You need to let go when you're ready, and when you do, remember that you aren't letting go of love or letting go of her. You're just letting go of the pain. You've been carrying it too long. Dinner was a quiet affair, other than Narcissa's attempts at conversation and engagement. Thankfully, she was feeling better from earlier, but in the same breath, she was trying to prod Hermione into conversation and not doing a good job at hiding it. She knew she should have diverted and encouraged more interaction between her and Scorpius, but she was drained, empty, and in no mood. Scorpius held on to her cardigan throughout dinner, but she thought it was more because of her silence than his nerves. Comfort. For her. Are you feeling well tonight, Miss Granger? She wasn't going to answer, but there was a concerned little boy hanging on to her every word. I'm fine, thank you. Just tired. It's been quite a day. I heard you took Scorpius to visit his father for lunch. Hopefully it was before the unfortunate news broke in the Prophet's Evening Edition. Hermione had forgotten all about that in the wake of the day, but she couldn't muster the energy to wonder what had transpired. He advised he would be having dinner elsewhere. She had told Scorpius already to ease his disappointment over Draco's absence. I imagine that is why Draco is delayed. Narcissa made a contended noise that was clearly an attempt to draw Hermione into her snare of conversation. It has been nice to have him home for dinner as of late. Returning to stifling her words, Hermione finished her water as dinner concluded. Narcissa feigned tiredness after her third potion and bid them both good night. With just the two of them, Scorpius relaxed completely, signing to ask if she was okay. Hermione put on her bravest smile. I'm fine. Cleaning after themselves passed in a blur with a helpful little boy rinsing dishes that could easily have been scrubbed with magic. Catherine handled his bedtime preparations. Hermione followed with a story, and once they finished Winnie the Pooh, she turned on the projector and picked out as many constellations as she could find until she noticed he'd fallen asleep. After that, time burned like a hidden fire that threatened to break out into a devastating conflagration. Hermione worked in Draco's office, or tried to. Thoughts and feelings poured through her fingers like sand. With Scorpius in bed, her work finished for the evening, and Draco running very late, there was little to distract her. She was tired enough to consider taking another potion to ensure she would be awake when Draco arrived home, but knew better. More than one potion would make sleep impossible for days, so she took to the outdoors in an effort to clear her mind. Her thoughts followed anyway. There was no storm in the forecast, but the air seemed disturbed, charged. Or maybe she was projecting. The garden wasn't as vast as the space surrounding her house, nor as open, but for tonight it would have to do. Hermione tilted her head up to the dark sky and opened her mind, allowing herself to arrange the story of Astoria, Draco, and Theo. She didn't know everything, but what she did know made her heart ache for them all. Deep in thought, Hermione only realized she wasn't alone when she turned to go inside and spotted Draco by the glass door, the dull living room light illuminating him, waiting. She didn't remember much about the walk across the grass, but he silently held the door open for her. They ended up in the living room. Draco settled into the armchair, but Hermione was too restless to sit. How long have you been home? Long enough. Draco's voice was as stiff as his body. There was caution in his narrowed eyes. I imagine you have questions for me, pertaining to your earlier conversation. A breath escaped her. He told you. He did. Draco took off his glasses and placed them on the table, pinching the bridge of his nose between his fingers. I was hoping to have this conversation at a later point, but I knew what I was getting into when I married Astoria. We both knew exactly what our marriage was and what it wasn't. I'm not a perfect man, nor was I a perfect husband. She deserved far better than what she got. So did you. Hermione looked down at her shoe. You still do. Her words pulled Draco from the chair into her orbit, but gravity kept Hermione grounded, making her stay instead of flying off at his approach. At his touch, the purpose in it, the quiet request that accompanied the fingers sliding between hers, Hermione unconsciously stepped closer, letting him lead her back to his office, where they sat together on his sofa, ending the day just how it started. The touch was followed by a silence she couldn't sustain. Daphne said she was your best friend. She was. Draco remained quiet for a long moment, as he seemed to carefully walk a rough road. But I don't mourn for her like Theo does, if that's what you're concerned about. I do grieve her. It's not out of... He looked away, jaw working through the difficulty of each word. If that's why you feel you need to know the details, then you're mistaken. Our marriage was one of... I'm aware. Try as she might, Hermione couldn't slow her pulse enough to hide her own nervous tension. You have a past, just as I do. Regardless of the circumstances of your marriage, Astoria was your wife. I respect that. You're allowed to process her loss and grieve, even as you try to navigate things with me. Then why... I wanted to know so I can better understand. It's a lot to absorb. All of it. Hermione's confession felt monumental, but from the look he was giving her, he knew it all too well. But I don't want to discuss it tonight. Agreed. It happened easily, naturally. They went their separate ways to change into pajamas, and upon their return, Hermione found Draco wearing familiar frames while reading a book that floated at his eye level. The Picture of Dorian Gray, 2nd edition. The pages looked worn, used. He'd read it before, apparently many times. One finger swipe turned the page with fluid ease. Hermione initially leaned in to read over his shoulder, but one sidelong glance forced her to summon her own book and make herself comfortable beside him. A hand absently found hers with growing ease that transferred to her. Knowing the significance of his casual touches helped her settle and relax. Well, somewhat. Soon all was silent except the occasional turn of pages and their measured breaths. The weight and warmth of his hand served as a reminder of the shift between them. Just another in a series of what had already transpired and what was yet to come. Hermione mulled over her remaining time at the Malfoys' home while continuing to read about Anne's remaining time in Uppercross. Just when she was beginning to fall down a rabbit hole of thoughts, in a move that felt like another test, Draco brought their joined hands to his lips and brushed a kiss over her knuckles. A flash of surprised pleasure coursed through her, but his eyes never left his book. The clock on the wall chimed to note the new hour. Long after his lips were gone, the warmth remained. When words don't come easy, I make do with silence and find something in nothing. Strider Marcus Jones.